Hi everyone, my name is Justin Harrison and I am the chair of the General Education Assessment Subcommittee, the GEASC, I know it's a lot to say, at Ashford. And I just wanted to give some feedback and some guidelines about using the rubrics. You'll see that I've made some other videos about how to fill out the rubric for the communication competency. Again, this rubric is going to be implemented in senior level courses at Ashford and or capstones. So you are scheduled to teach one of those courses. And the main reason why we're doing this is because we have to gather data about how well students are satisfying or their skills in relation to the general education competencies. And the faculty at Ashford decided to start with the communication competency because it's so important for our students to be able to communicate well. And so what you'll find in this training is various things that you'll need to complete in order to successfully complete the training. But you'll be given two papers that were analyzed by the Gen Ed Assessment Subcommittee, where we all got together and we attempted to determine what, quote unquote, the golden standard in relation to all of the content criteria. We also outlined the performance levels within the rubric itself and worked together, collaborated to try and do the best we could in relation to those performance levels. And just in facilitating a few of these trainings, I've noticed some common occurrences in the discussions and in the course itself, and I wanted to talk a little bit about how to approach the rubric itself and how to approach the papers. So you'll be given two examples of papers with the standards. So for example, proficient, distinguished, below expectations, basic, outlined in relation to each one of the performance levels within the rubric. And so you can analyze those papers and see what the committee decided the levels were. And then you'll be asked to analyze a paper that you don't know the golden standard for, and then you will assign the different levels, distinguished, proficient, basic, to that paper. And then what you'll ultimately do is take a quiz. Again, it's not graded, so don't worry about it in that sense. But you'll say, in relation to performance level 1, I put proficient. And then when you submit your answers, you'll see whether or not the scores that you gave aligned with the focus group that was used to try and calculate this golden standard. Now, if you're off by one performance level, for example, let's say you said proficient and the committee decided that it was a distinguished level performance. If you're off by one, that's pretty good when it comes to analysis of inner rate or reliability. And you shouldn't worry about that if you're off in any of these categories. Everybody's going to have their own perspective on these things, but a couple things that I've seen other faculty fall into, I just want to talk about. One thing that I've seen faculty fall into is they say, distinguished, 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 distinguished. And in their explanation of why they gave those performance levels, they will say, this paper is better than or equal to the best papers that I've ever graded before. So one thing I want everyone to think about when they're grading is not to think at all about the papers that you've graded before or how students have performed in those papers and the grades that you've given those papers. Instead, you should focus on the performance levels themselves. So if the proficient level for APA citation says that the student paper has fewer than 3 mistakes, but is not perfect, so not perfect, but 3 or fewer mistakes, then you should analyze the paper in relation to that performance level, not in relation to how well students have done on previous papers that you've graded at Ashford or anything like that. And of course, if you don't do this, I don't want to be condescending or anything. I'm just saying that these are typical, typical academics fall into these things. Obviously we compare students to each other and we compare grades and we think of evaluation in terms of grades and comparisons, and that's, I would say there's strong evidence that you should do that in specific instances. But in this instance, all we're trying to gather is how proficient the student is in relation to each criterion. We don't care about how they perform in relation to each other. We've spent a lot of time defining the different performance levels in the attempt to allow people to choose the performance level that matches the student's level of understanding. So the first thing that I would warn against is comparing this paper to anything but the performance levels underneath the different criteria in the rubric. Don't think, oh wow, this paper might be a lot better or a lot worse compared to others. Instead, look at the specific levels and evaluate the paper based on those levels. The second thing I would caution against is thinking in terms of grades. The rubric that you're going to be filling out has nothing at all to do with grades, and I know that that can be kind of counterintuitive for people, but grades are not a direct measure of understanding or learning. And here's a simple example. Let's say that you get, and oftentimes people think that grades are a direct measure of understanding and learning. Let's say that you get a paper that is the most amazing paper you've ever seen. The student satisfies every single rubric criteria. The prose is amazing. The level is beyond what you've ever seen. But the paper was 2 days late. And so by the university policy or by your own policy, the student gets 10% off per day. And so this is a 100% paper, but in the grade book, the grade is 80%. Well, you can see in this example that the student has displayed a distinguished level of understanding and performance in relation to the activity. And so the learning of the student, or the ability or the facility that the student has in engaging these topics and these different behaviors, is at the highest level for your university. But the grade itself is an 80%, which seems to indicate that the student is between an average level student and a high performance student, with an A student B, let's say, being considered a distinguished level, B being a high level, C being an average level, and D being below expectations level. And so that's a simple example to demonstrate that grades are not an implicit measure of understanding and learning. And so the second thing I would caution against is to think of the rubric in terms of grades. Don't think that proficient means a B+, basic means a C+, below expectations means a D+, and then non-performance is a 0. Instead, again, evaluate the paper based on the content criteria. The rubric itself has no influence on the student's grades, and you shouldn't think in terms of grades. You should only think in terms of the criteria and the performance levels themselves. So what we're saying is that a proficient student at Ashford is somebody who has a proficient level mastery of, let's say, again, the criterion, is able to use APA citation methods properly. A distinguished level would be absolutely no mistakes at all, according to the rubric. The basic level means that that this Ashford student has a relatively solid grasp of APA, but there are still significant errors such that that this student would be considered in the mid to lower, in the basic level of Ashford students, in kind of the mid-range, but below the high-performing and distinguished students, but above the below expectations performance. So again, don't think in terms of grades. Like, don't think, oh, well, this is an A paper, so I should give proficient, distinguished, proficient, distinguished, proficient, distinguished, because that's what I would give in relation to a grade that I would give in another class. So think outside of those two. And I know it's hard to do, but the first, think outside of comparing this paper or any paper that you evaluate using this rubric in your own classes to other students in the class. Instead, focus on the content criteria and the performance levels, and pay attention to those performance levels and the differences between those. Sometimes those differences are subtle, and sometimes they are ambiguous. We admit that. But again, we do our best to to distinguish between those performance levels such that one is able to select one or the other with a high level of confidence. And then the other thing is to think outside of the realm of grades and instead think, how proficient in relation to the performance levels did this student satisfy that criterion? Okay, so anyway, that's a little video about two things that I would caution against. And again, thank you for participating in the training, and I hope that you find it informative and useful.